Oops. What a way to start. Oh, we were doing so well. Hello, Soundies. It's good to have you all here today. Happy Mother's Day. We have a good show, I think, for today. Pretty kind of low key, not a whole ton to cover, but we did have some great questions that were submitted ahead of time, so we'll cover those. And first of all, word of the day. Emma tells me that in the intro music there's some vocalizations, and they're not. I mean, they're probably words at some point, but they were very heavily affected. And she says that is called vocal chops. I don't know, Lloyd, is that the same term you've heard as well for that? So anyway, that was really interesting to me. That's getting the music perspective here. So thank you to the musicians amongst us for helping out with that. Let's go ahead and jump over to our agenda, and we'll take a look at what we've got for today. First up, for those that have not subscribed already to the 20,000 Hertz podcast, I've recommended it in the past. I highly recommend it again. It's my favorite podcast. The host is Dallas Taylor of De Facto Sound, so they do sound design, and they do a top-notch job. It is just a fantastic podcast. And they did a recent episode where they covered the Shure SM7. I know this was actually, I'm already subscribed to it, so I would have gotten to it eventually, but Alan Quevedo actually alerted me to this, sent me an email and said, hey, did you see this episode? They're talking about the Shure SM7. And they joined up with Shure, and they actually did a history, basically, of the Shure SM7, which was originally... Oh, now it's going to test my memory. I think it was originally released in 1972. So, and it's gone through a couple of iterations, SM7, SM7A, and SM7B. The differences are pretty minor between them. It's definitely the same microphone in terms of DNA, but there's just been a few minor changes to it in terms of, I think the A version, they changed some of the electronics just a touch. And then on the B version, it was just a different pop shield, basically the foam cover. So anyway, very interesting podcast. I think that particular episode is only about 20, 25 minutes, so it's pretty short, but I thought it was fascinating. So hopefully you guys will enjoy that as well. And then next up, we have a variety of questions related to sound. So let's jump into those. First up from Ron R. If you haven't answered this question before, I would like to know the pros and cons in terms of features, quality, and usability of buying a new MixPre 6.2 versus something like a used 744T or other used professional SD model that typically sells used for a few $100s above or below a new MixPre. So that is a fine question. Let me just show you over here at the Sound Devices website, first of all. So I think you already know this, Ron, but the 7 series is no longer in production. They don't make new copies of that anymore. So the new ones that they've merged their recorder line and their mixer line into one, which is now the 8 series, and they no longer make those new. So I think one of the biggest there are two big considerations that come to mind initially. Number one is the fact that they're no longer in production. So the first thing I'd want to do is contact Sound Devices support and try and get a sense for how long they're going to support those and actually service them. So if something breaks and you need it serviced, my sense is that they'll continue to service it as long as they can still source the parts for it. And probably that's going to be a while, but you probably want to contact them and get a sense for that. And I think the second consideration is, pardon me, is what are you going to do with it? Yeah, if you're going to be working on relatively large film production jobs, where you need to have balanced outputs, I think that's a consideration because you're going to get that on a 7 series. You have to go up to the MixPre 10, in which case you get balanced outputs, but they're on, I don't know on the 7 series, I don't remember, but on the MixPre 10, they're TA3 outputs, so they're the smaller ones, so you do have to have adapter cables, but you do get balanced outputs. And that'll be important in some cases for the bigger productions where you have more complex routing and output needs to be able to send IFBs or Comtex or something like that to other members of the crew. Or also if you have your own boom operator, you're going to want some way to communicate with them. So you're probably going to want an output. They may want to mix. So it depends. If you're going to be doing something like that, then that's where a 7 series or at least a MixPre 10 probably makes more sense from my perspective. The little 833, that's a bigger price definitely than a MixPre 10, but that little device can do so much. It's amazing, and my 888 frankly is more than I need in 99% of cases. So I don't know what your aspirations are or where you're planning to head, but those are my two main things. I definitely would contact Sound Devices and see, how long they're going to support what they've got. I was actually, interestingly, I was talking with, many of you may know, what is his name now? His name escapes me. Wu. Watson Wu, he's mostly records sound effects. Watson and I were having a conversation a few months ago, and I mean, I think there's he still uses a 7, I don't know if it's a 788, he uses a 7 series for the majority of his work. And I think he's starting to feel a little nervous, like, what's my next step after when Sound Devices gets to a point where they can't even service them anymore, what do I do then? So there are people that are using those that are already thinking along those lines. So that would be the main thing I'd be concerned about, or just kind of cognizant of when you make that decision. If this is going to be a stepping stone for you and you're maybe getting your feet wet, you do aspire to work on those bigger productions, then maybe it makes sense. I would have a time period in mind for how long you plan to rely on it. And also keep in mind too, when you start working on bigger things, you do have to have backups as well. So for example, when I show up on set, and I haven't done this for a while now, but when I do my backup, I usually have a backup. So the MixPre 10 will usually be my backup, and my primary mixer will be the 888. So you'll want to have at least a backup plan of some sort. If you don't have a backup mixer, at least have some plans for what you're going to do in case you have an equipment issue when you get to the location or the set. So, all right. Thanks for that one, Ron. We have a question. Mark, what does it mean to have balanced outputs? Okay, that's a good question. Without getting into all the technical details, basically a balanced output, you can run longer cables with less risk of picking up interference. That's the main advantage of balanced outputs. It's really helpful if you're sending audio to another piece of professional equipment to have a balanced output, because they usually have balanced inputs. So it has to be balanced on both sides of that connection. So that's the main thing that it means, Mark. Unbalanced outputs are usually 3.5 millimeter outputs, so the kind of thing that you would run to a mirrorless camera. That it's fine, the audio quality wise, an unbalanced output can sound just as good as a balanced, but you do run a higher risk of picking up interference on those cables because they're not balanced. The way they do the balancing is very interesting, and we can talk about that in more detail another time, but the basic idea is they send the same thing on two different wires out of phase of each other, and then they sum them, and then any differences they can assume is noise, and then they can remove that. So that's how they deal with noise and create this sort of immunity to interference and noise with balanced cables. So that's the main idea. All right. Thanks, Ron, for that question. J.H. Brooks says, with all the buzz about the Lark 150 and the Rode Wireless Go 2, why is the Pico gear never in the conversation or comparisons? Great question. So for those that are not familiar with it, there's a company called Pico Gear, and they make a product called the Pico Mic. The Pico Mic is a dual-channel consumer 2.4 gigahertz wireless microphone system. So it has two transmitters and a single receiver, and then you run the output of the receiver into your mirrorless camera, for example, or maybe an audio recorder. I reviewed it probably 2 years ago, maybe a little bit longer than that. I will say this, Mr. Brooks, from my perspective, the microphone sounded pretty awful on the Pico mic. That was my biggest downside on that. I loved pretty much everything else about, well, two things that I didn't like. The microphone sounded awful, and number two, there was no 3.5 millimeter input to use a different lavalier microphone. You had to use the microphone built into the tiny little transmitter on the Pico mic. So that was my issue with it. Then the third thing was that Pico gear, about the time I released my review, from that point on, for at least 9 months, they were completely out of stock. And so nobody could buy one. And then I think they got some stock in for maybe a couple of weeks, and then they were out of stock again for a long number of months. Actually, if we go to the website right now, you can see, I just checked this yesterday, Ash, when she brought your question up. It looks like they finally have some stock. So you could actually buy one. It also looks like they've changed things a little bit. So there's now a 50 meter range version, which I assume is the one that I reviewed. And they also have a long range version, which will be allegedly available in May 2021. So we'll see. But that's the main reason I didn't include it in my comparisons. I just didn't feel like it was a serious contender from my perspective. Total opinion. I just did not like the sound of the microphones at all. And I didn't like that there was no 3.5 millimeter input to power or to bring in another microphone if you wanted to. What I did like about the Pico mic is that the receiver was fantastic. The screen was beautiful. It was very easy to use. The menus made sense. They were easy to navigate and operate. So for me, if they would just put a 3.5 millimeter input on that, that would solve a lot of the problems, and then figure out a way to to keep them in stock so people can buy them are the two main things. So hopefully that helps and provides a little bit of context. I would also add to that list is the Blink 500 Pro is another one that's getting a lot of attention at the moment, which is relatively new, that we reviewed a few months back as well, maybe a month and a half. All right, next up from Scott W. I'm planning to video interview my 93-year-old grandmother sometime in the next few months. I'll do the interview at her home over the course of a long weekend, probably this month or next. I have access to the following equipment: Sennheiser MKH416 and Boom Pole, Rode Wireless Go, Rode Video Mic NTG, Zoom F6, Godox SL60, and a 90 centimeter parabolic diffuser or softbox, Sony a7 III, and an Atomos Ninja 5. So you've got a great set of equipment there. Definitely should be able to do the job nicely. I've watched dozens of YouTube videos, including many of yours, and I'm feeling reasonably comfortable with the operation of the equipment I'll be using. I have a high-level comfort with the overall vision and concept for the interview. I've done 2 or 3 small video interview projects to practice, but still I'm feeling a bit tentative about the actual execution of this really important project. What tips do you have to help me capitalize on this opportunity in order to get the best output possible? I'm asking for any sound, lighting, video, workflow tips. It may not be obvious to a beginner like me. The first thought I have is you need a helper. You've got a lot going on there. I don't know that you're planning to use all of that equipment. I would use 2 microphones, a lavalier and a boom mic. I probably wouldn't get too hardcore about, well, maybe it's up to you. I don't know what you're planning on interconnecting. In other words, are you going to feed the audio out from the F6 into the Ninja or into the camera? Whatever you're planning on doing, it wouldn't be a bad idea to do that. Number one, I wouldn't have grandma sit there while you're setting all that up. You've got a lot to set up. I would have a stand-in, someone that can sit in and you can get the lighting worked out, get the sound worked out, so that when she sits down, you do a very quick sound test and you roll. That's the first thing. Second, you have a lot of equipment there, so I would probably get a helper. I don't know who's doing the interview. Are you doing the interview plus operating everything? If so, you might want to get a helper that can, help you manage everything and can at least keep their eyes on the camera. They can know what the battery or power status of everything is. Another thing, have a power strategy. If you're going to, basically said you're going to be there for a weekend, it sounded like, course of a long weekend. I don't know how long the interview is going to be, but probably you're going to start running up against limits of battery capacity, so you're going to need to power everything. So you need somebody that's watching all the equipment to make sure you still have power and being able to call timeout and be able to change out batteries if you're using batteries, or if you are powering via AC, have that worked out as well as backup batteries, just so that you have that on hand and don't kind of ruin the flow of things there. Let's see. Yeah, I just find what a lot of people don't realize, they think they can do everything when it just works better if you have multiple people. So for example, for our live stream here, we have 2 people. We have Emma, who is our technical director, who is operating the switcher, and she's keeping, monitoring things so she knows if I do something stupid or dumb, like let the song start the second time when we're trying to start the live stream. So it makes it easier to spot problems and solve them before they become serious problems, is kind of my thought on that. So I'm a big fan of that. In terms of lighting, light from the far side if you can. I don't know if you're planning on having her look straight into the camera. A lot of times for interviews, we have people look off camera just a little bit, and I would light with that diffuser. I would light the far side of her face and have it wrap around a little bit. Or a lot of people say you light the fill side of the face, or you shoot the fill side of the face. That generally looks a little bit more interesting and adds a little more dimension to your person, the person that you're interviewing's face, in this case, your grandmother. So I don't know. Those are some thoughts there. If anyone else has other ideas, definitely put those in the chat to help out our friend Scott here. So Scott, good luck, and I hope it comes out well. All right, next up from Michael. Michael says, how do you hire yourself out for sound in regards to responsibilities for gear, mixing, post, and specific advice for clarity with clients I find critical? All right. So first of all, let me just give some context of where I'm coming from, because I think the answer differs depending on what you're doing and what your aspirations are. I am not a full-time production sound mixer for TV and film. I'm basically a videographer for mostly doing corporate video. So probably before the pandemic, I was probably doing 4 to 5 location freelance jobs a year as a sound mixer. And in those cases, every single one of those cases, I was the entire sound department. I did everything. So I was booming. I was, and in fact, in some cases, I was more than the sound department. I was actually also helping with camera as well in some cases. So in those cases, typically the way it happens is I have a series of contacts here, or probably a handful of contacts here in my area that generally are the ones I'm working through over and over again. So we have it pretty well worked out. And they'll usually call and say, okay, what's your current day rate and what's your kit fee? And that's usually, I'll just quote them that depending on, obviously if I'm available for that particular job. So that's pretty straightforward. So what I try to do, and when they ask what's a kit fee, I say, tell me more about the job. Let's talk about what we're trying to do here, and how many people do we have to mic? How many wireless channels do we need? Where are we going to be location-wise, so on and so forth. So I can get a sense if I need to rent anything. I've never actually had to rent anything. I've borrowed things a couple of times, but usually I have enough equipment on hand that I can do it without having to rent, so that keeps the rental fee down, or the kit fee down a little bit. And then sometimes they'll ask for a half day. I've done a few half day things as well, so those are pretty straightforward. Usually that's just like a sit-down interview, and it usually lasts for 2 to 3 hours. So that's usually how I do it. I don't know if there's something else beyond. Oh, another thing I do try to, another thing that's very important to ask is, what do you want for deliverables? So usually I deliver a polywave, a series of polywave files that have the boom mic plus any wireless mics we use. I can also add a mix if they want to do that. If they don't know what I'm talking about at that point, I just cut the mix out because they're not going to use it, and they don't know what I'm talking about. So I've had that, it's been interesting because some, even groups that I would have expected to know that, okay, the first 2 channels are a stereo mix, and even when I told them that was a stereo mix, I watched the final piece later, and I see that they just put everything in. They put the ISOs in with the stereo mix, and I got one in particular was a standing interview out in the woods, and it was a beautiful setting, and it sounded horrible. There was all sorts of phasing issue because they had left the ISOs in along with the boom. And I was really disappointed, but what I learned from that experience is that you have to be crystal clear on what they want as a deliverable, and they may or may not want a stereo mix. A lot of times I find a lot of those places, they just want isolated channels. And so a lot of times what I've started doing now is that, if we start having that conversation and I find they have, the producer or the director doesn't know what I'm talking about, that's usually more of a videography kind of job, and they're not usually as experienced. What I find is it's better off just to deliver ISOs generally. And then I just give them a little thing at the end. I give them a thumb drive if I'm using the Mix Pre, or I just give them the SD card when I'm using the 888. And I also include on that a PDF sound report so they know what everything is. And that way they know, for the editor, a lot of times it's just editors that are finishing it. They don't even have a mixer in post for a lot of the types of things that I'm working on. So in those cases, they're like, whoa, what's this PDF? Whoa, PDF, this is awesome. I have all the information. I know which channel is what, and so on and so forth. And they're kind of usually delighted. But also I'll explain that to whomever I give the deliverable to at the end of the day. So those are kind of some of my thoughts on what I do as far as process and working out the details with the clients. Second, and practically, our next production where I am one-man sound is a short of deaf parents with a coda child?
Child of deaf adult.
Child of deaf adult, okay. And there will be no dialogue. So I'm going after all the ambiance and Foley I can get, no lavs. I've watched A Quiet Place 3 times, even considering building a Decatree from borrowed Omnis in a Mix Pre 2 on Wingman. And locations vary from a deep redwood forest cabin to Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco. Any thoughts on storytelling with audio for video and no voices present? Yes. definitely have some thoughts. So the last production or the last kind of short film that I worked on before the pandemic started was one that had one line of dialogue, or maybe two. We actually demonstrated in one of our sound for video sessions a few months ago. So if you want to go look that up, you can take a look at that and see how I approached it. I would say my philosophy on a film like that is that there are a couple of layers. Number one, the kind of the baseline that you have to deliver is you need to ensure that the audience is not pulled out of the story. So that's the obvious baseline, and we'll talk in just a second about what I would do beyond that. But the obvious baseline is you don't want anyone to be pulled out of the story because sound is missing or it doesn't kind of seem to match with the picture in some way. Like even with Foley, you don't necessarily have to record something that's producing the sound that's actually seen in the scene. For example, when crushing bones, they always use celery. They break celery to get the sound of crushing bones or breaking bones. So think outside the box there. But the idea is, first of all, you have to deliver this kind of baseline threshold of don't pull people out of the story. And so that's what your coverage needs to start with. Then I think beyond that, what starts to get interesting is that when you're telling the story, you can start to do things that are more stylized that help push the story forward. So you have to have a very clear understanding of the vision of the director of the film and what they're trying to achieve and what they're trying to convey with the film. And so you can then use Foley or ambiances to help heighten that message, make sure that message gets through in a really effective way. So your voices in this case are ambiances and Foley. So it's a really interesting opportunity, and it sounds like you're excited about it. I'm excited for you about it. It's a great opportunity for you as a sound mixer to get in and really kind of help tell that story. So those are my kind of my philosophy on how you approach those dialogue-free films. So hopefully that's helpful, and good luck, Michael. All right, next up to Cole. Hey, Curtis, I'm planning to upgrade production cameras from the Canon C100 Mark II to the C70. When it comes to using my standard XLR microphones, the 416 and the 50, wireless packs, etc., what should I keep in mind in terms of converting to XLR Mini? The reason he's asking this is the Canon C70 has these TA3, the mini XLR inputs instead of the full size. Is there an ideal way to do this, or is it as simple as buying a handful of short converter cables? I think basically it's as simple as buying the right converter cables. In fact, here I put a link for this down below, but here on the screen, here's a B&H cable. So this is just the mini XLR male, so TA3M to XLR F, so female on the XLR side. You can get it in different lengths here. You can get it in 5, 25 feet, and 16-inch. I usually use the 16-inch, and just on my C70, I run that into the input on the C70 and then wrap it around the handle when I have it on a tripod at least. Wrap it around the handle so it doesn't yank on the connector to the input, and then I just run the full-size XLR cables from there. So that's how I do it, and that should be fine. The inputs can, of course, supply phantom power, so you've got everything you need on the C70 as far as audio is concerned. The only thing that the C70 doesn't do, I don't remember if the C100 Mark II did this, the C200 does. The C200 inputs are actually, bump that, let's go back. The C200 inputs are actually switchable to digital as well. I don't know that the C100 Mark II did that or not, and the C70 does not do that either, but that's the only limitation really. So if you don't need to do digital audio, then you're fine. Don't worry about that. But yeah, you can supply phantom power, and those adapter cables do it. So it's really that simple. So hope you make some great stuff with that, Cole. Congratulations on the new camera. All right, next up from Andrew, we have a question. And I want to give a little bit of background here. So here's Andrew here. This has been an easy way for me to achieve appropriate compression for loudness normalization, talking about the kind of the process we've talked about a whole bunch of times about how to compress and then you can loudness normalize. But now I'm starting to wonder if my audio might sound a little better utilizing dual band compression. Can you please show me how I might be able to do this? I have Adobe Audition, Isotope RX8 Standard, and Nectar, and the Span plugin currently at my disposal. So yeah, let's take a look at, so Andrew also was kind enough to send over a little audio clip here, and we can switch over to that here. So I think I didn't put the whole thing on there. It was kind of a long email, but what Andrew was concerned about was sibilance. And He feels like maybe dual band compression can help him deal with that. I would actually say, Andrew, first of all, just to kind of preface this, we will go ahead and run through how you can do a dual band compressor. But I wanted to just kind of say a couple things. First of all, you may be a little confused because in my original Adobe Audition course, we did run through dual band compression a little bit for dialogue. And I think there's a place for it, but I also, since then, I've kind of changed my approach to that a little bit. I'll generally just use a single band compressor and then go back and use a de-esser. That's generally how I approach it. But you can go about it either way. And really what it comes down to is use your ears and figure out to you what sounds the best. You have to trust your ears when you get into post-production. And that's a thing that I think a lot of people getting started they don't trust themselves. They don't trust their ears and they want guidance. And it does take a little bit of time to develop that, but get in there. You have to do it, and you just have to do it over and over and over again until you start to feel more comfortable with it. So definitely do that. So let me just kind of show you how I would approach it and why, in some cases, dual band compression might make sense. Why is this on? That's really weird. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close that for just a second. So here's the clip that Andrew sent over. Let's just run through it first and so you can see where we're starting. Oh, and actually before we do, just to see where we're sitting in terms of loudness, we're at minus 23.74 presently. So let's run through.
Do you think that this idea that salespeople have thick skin and they don't get affected, and you need to make sure that you give it to them, keep on motivating them, get the pace up, rah rah rah? Why is it so important as a sales leader to actually nurture the emotions of your team?
Okay. So that's where we're starting, and a couple things that we're not going to spend time on this today. There's a couple mouth clicks here that I'd probably address. There's one there, and there was another one here I heard. You can just get those with the declicker in Isotope RX, but we'll keep the rest of it here in Adobe Audition and just kind of let me show you what I would do. First thing I would do is you've got frequency analysis, so you can actually pop this open and just do a scan of the whole clip here just to get a sense for what the audio looks like in terms of the overall frequency energy across the entire clip. And you can see there's this kind of natural break here, somewhere between 5 and 6 kilohertz. And I think that probably some of this here is the sibilance in her voice, and it's not bad in her case. And in fact, you have to have some of that presence there to ensure that you keep articulation and the ability for people to understand what's being said. So I don't really feel like there's a ton of sibilance here, and we're not dealing with a sibilance problem from my point of view. However, if you think about it, let me just pull this open again and actually do that scan again. If I pull out a compressor, and let's just say I pulled the threshold down to here, you can see I'd mostly just be affecting and pushing down, reducing the amplitude of the low frequencies. I wouldn't be really touching any of this other stuff. So that would all stay the same. So what would happen is this would get pushed down and it would be closer to this presence stuff here. So it might start to sound like there is more sibilance. So that's one thing you have to kind of keep your ears open for, is that after you do some compression, you can start to kind of emphasize some of those things a little bit more. So I'll go ahead and get rid of that off the screen so we have a little more real estate to work with. I would come up to Effects, Amplitude and Compression. We'll pull out that, where did it go? Our multiband compressor, there it is. Okay. So the first thing I've done is this is actually a 4-channel multiband compressor, and I really just want to do 2 bands. So I'm going to take these other bands and push them off to the side so they're out of the way, so they're not really messing with us. And then what I would do is take this one and kind of move it to that spot where we were seeing that natural break between the lower frequencies and the higher frequencies. And in fact, what I can do is I can actually play the audio back a bit and watch the frequency analysis here, the real-time analyzer. Watch this.
To them, keep on motivating them, get the pace up, rah, rah, rah. Why is it so important as a sales leader to actually nurture the emotions of your team?
Sure. Okay. So I think that's probably a pretty good spot there. So we can compress this a little bit differently than the lower frequencies here in the mids, and save something, to manage the upper frequencies separately. So what I'm going to do, and in fact what I've done already, is I have already set up the defaults here on these 2 bands. So because I pushed those others 2, we're not going to use the purple and the blue. We're just using the kind of yellowish gold and the green. Those are the 2 bands that we're actually going to do compression on. I'm going to go ahead and set the ratio on both of them to 3:1. Right now I've got 0 gain, so we're not pushing anything up. We've left our threshold at 0 to start, And that's the one thing I'm going to tweak when we start playing back. And then just as a start, I've set our attack to 0 milliseconds and our release to 500, just kind of give a fairly transparent kind of sound to the overall compression. So I'm going to start playing back, run through it, and this is where you start using your ears to hear how the compression is affecting things. So I'll probably use the lower band first and kind of adjust the threshold down, and then I'll come back and grab the higher frequencies as well and start to address those. So use your best headphones if you've got them to make sense of this, and let's run through it.
Do you think that this idea that salespeople have thick skin and they don't get affected, and you need to make sure that you give it to them, keep on motivating them, get the pace up, rah rah rah? Why is it so important as a sales leader to actually nurture the emotions of your team?
Sure, good question.
Do you think that this idea that salespeople have thick skin and they don't get affected, and you need to make sure that you give it to them, keep on motivating them, get the pace up, rah rah rah? Why is it so important as a sales leader to actually nurture the emotions of your team?
Sure, good question.
Do you think that this idea that salespeople have thick skin and they don't get affected, and you need to make sure that you give it to them, keep on motivating them, get the pace up, rah rah rah? Why is it so important as a sales leader to actually nurture the emotions of your team?
Sure, good question.
Do you think that this idea that salespeople have thick skin and they don't get affected, and you need to make sure that you give it to them, keep on motivating them, get the pace up, rah rah rah? Why is it so important as a sales leader to actually nurture the emotions of your team?
Okay. So hopefully that was instructive to you. Again, what we were trying to do there is we were trying to be able to boost the levels a little bit here. So you notice I pushed the output gain up a bit as well. And so what I did is I first used this kind of lower band here up to about 5 kilohertz to get all of the lows and the mids. And then I used a separate band here to get anything above 5 kilohertz. And you'll notice, actually, if I go and play this again, you'll notice that when she says the letter S or C, that's when you're going to get the reduction on the higher frequencies, and when she's saying other things that have more bass power to them, more kind of low and mid power to them, you'll see this one doing the reduction. So let's just run through it again so you can see that visually.
Do you think that this idea that salespeople have thick skin and they don't get affected, and you need to make sure that you give it to them, keep on motivating them, get the pace up, rah rah rah? Why is it so important as a sales leader to actually nurture the emotions of your team?
Okay, so you can see how that goes. Now, another thing too is to listen for is that when I push this band way down, like I push the threshold way down at one point, and notice what it does to her voice. Kind of interesting. In fact, we might roll this back. Let's pull it back to about 4 kilohertz. Well, no, I don't want to go too far, maybe 4,500. Watch what happens when I pull this way down, or listen to what happens, I should say, when I pull the threshold way down on this and we start compressing those higher frequencies more aggressively.
Do you think that this idea that salespeople have thick skin and they don't get affected, and you need to make sure that you give it to them, keep on motivating them, get the pace up, rah rah rah? Why is it so important as a sales leader to actually nurture the emotions of your team?
So the way I would describe that is it started to sound kind of unnatural. When I backed off on the threshold on that higher band, then it started to sound more in balance, a little bit more natural. It almost starts to sound a little lispy sometimes too. If you really crush those higher frequencies, the person will start to sound like they have a lisp, which is not a good sound either. But overall, Andrew, that's kind of how I would approach it. Now, another thing to consider too is, again, a lot of times I will end up just using for dialogue, I'll end up using a single band compressor and then come in instead. And actually, let's go ahead and process this and just see what it does to the waveform, just so you can see how it looks differently. And that actually got us to minus 18 LUFS, and still left plenty of headroom there. So we've probably got our true peak is probably still well within what we need. Yeah, our true peak is still minus 3.27. So we could go probably actually even boost the output gain a little bit more, maybe another dB or so. But anyway, what I was going to say is, let me undo that. I would also not be afraid. And actually, typically today, what I'll do is I'll use a de-esser instead. And the thing about a de-esser is that rather than compress all of the higher frequencies, it's going to target mainly that sibilance. And so you can really kind of tune in the sibilant sound to exactly how you want it. And so let me see here. It's been a while since I've done it here, but I'm trying to remember where the de-esser is in here. I haven't used Adobe Audition for that. Here it is under amplitude and compression. So the way this de-esser works is you actually specify a band where you think it will be, and you can actually move. So it's this black area here. So it's generally in her voice. I think it was about somewhere above 5,000. You can be pretty specific. And the nice thing about this one is you can actually run the sibilance only, so you can actually dial it in to where it sits exactly. Let's run through and let you hear.
Do you think that this idea that salespeople have thick skin and they don't get affected, and you need to make sure that you give it to them, keep on motivating them, get the pace up, rah, rah, rah. Why is it so important as a sales leader to actually nurture the
See, again, she does not have a lot of sibilance in her voice. She's actually a pretty balanced voice, so I don't really feel like a ton of any of this sort of de-essing is really necessary. The multiband compressor would be fine, I think, and just doing a really light touch on the higher frequencies just to keep it in balance with the lower frequencies. So that's how I would approach it. So thanks for that question, Andrew. All right. We have some time for some questions from the chat. So if you've got a question, if you wouldn't mind just putting @CurtisJetAudio, that'll make it easier for Emma to find it. We'll put it up on the screen and we'll run through the questions here real quickly. So, okay, which lavalier microphones would you use for very loud sounds like car exhausts? Yeah, so the kind of the important thing you're looking for there is something that can handle high sound pressure levels, and a lot of the less expensive microphones can't do that. So you're looking for a spec that says max SPL, and that's what's going to help you be able to manage something that's really coming in hot, really, really loud. Exhaust, unless you're using like a supercar, I don't know, well, or something with a straight pipe, is not usually super duper loud. It depends. It really depends on what you're recording. But let me just take a look here at a couple of microphones here. Let's look at the Shure Twinplex and just see what its spec is. And then, Emma, you can go ahead and pull this up here. Let's see if they've got the specs here. Pull that spec up. Here's the max SPL, 142 dB SPL. That's about as high as you're going to see lavalier microphones go. So that might be a good choice there, actually. This is the Twinplex TL48 with an XLR termination. So that could be a pretty good choice. I don't know what you're recording into. Again, you have to keep in mind if you're going wireless as well. If you're plugging the lavalier microphone into a wireless system, there's going to be, the capabilities of that system to represent that wide dynamic range and the max SPL there as well. So you have to keep that in mind as well. But as far as lavaliers, that's about as good as you're going to find. I haven't seen a lot of lavaliers that can achieve a higher max sound pressure level than that. So that's the main thing I'd look for. Cloudy OS. Did I see that right? Okay, cool. Mike, sorry, Curtis, but your explanation of how balanced works is a commonly held misconception. Too complicated to explain why in chat. That's fair enough, Mike. I think maybe we need to have you back on the show and talk to us a little bit about that and how it works. I can say, in terms of misconceptions, I believe it is sending audio down two different wires and then doing something with it at the other end. So it's able to essentially find the noise and interference, and we'll talk about the technicalities in another one, but thank you, Mike. I appreciate that. Rob, thanks for the super chat. Is there a way to connect a Deity VLAV to either a Rodecaster Pro and or an ATEM Mini Pro? I tried the phone input on the Rodecaster, but no luck. Thank you. Yes, well, what you can use is you can use the VXLR Plus from Rode, which will convert the 3.5 millimeter to XLR. That'll go into one of the XLR inputs. I'm just a little surprised it didn't work on the Rodecaster Pro's phone input. Oh, because the phone input probably doesn't supply plug-in power. That's probably why that didn't work. Yeah, so we're going to want to use one of those adapters. Deity has one of those adapters as well, I believe. Don't remember what they call it, but Rode calls theirs the VXLR Plus. Or you can also go with the Rode VXLR Pro, one of the two of those. Technically, you probably want to go with the Pro. So that's what I would do to get that audio into your Rodecaster. ATEM Mini. It should work with the ATEM Mini Pro. You will want to, in the latest firmware, you have to turn the phantom power on. So in fact, let's go in there and show you what that looks like. Okay, if we come in here, so here into the audio, you would want to set the mic input to microphone plus plug-in power normal. That's what you'd want to set to power that microphone when you bring it into your ATEM Mini. So that should do that for you. Okay. Mr. Danielson, I have a Rode Wireless Go. I have no individual controls on sensitivity, gain, channels, and lock on 3.5 millimeter. I need something more pro, but every system, Musicom, Electro, etc., is 10 times more expensive. Is there any between? Yeah, there are some in-betweens. The Sennheiser G4 is in between. It's probably in the $600 range for a kit. It's not dual channel though, so I don't, there's the Deity Connect system, which it'll do the job. I've found it to be a little on the noisier than I'd like, but it does the job, and it's a dual channel system. You do have control over the sensitivity, but the thing I found with that is it feels like you have to optimize the gain and the output settings to get the least amount of noise. So that may not be a good choice for the case where you're going into it. What are you going into on a 3.5 millimeter that has no ability to change the gain or the input level? That's another thing to look at. I don't know what you're looking at on that side, but I'd probably look at a Sennheiser G4 system as a start. I just put out a review of the Godox W Mic S1. Sorry, I had to look at Emma to remember the name. It's a pretty, I wish it were better. It's a pretty good system. Sounds okay. The mic's a little kind of crunchy that it comes with, but it works fine indoors, but outdoors it was a mess. It just dropped the signal all over the place. So if you're working outdoors, that's a non-starter from my point of view. But those are some thoughts there. Probably the Sennheiser. If you want to go up a little bit more from there, but not as expensive as all of the Musicom and Electros and all that, Sony's UWP digital system is pretty nice. And I think they still sell their analog systems as well, which are a little bit less expensive. So they're probably more in the $1,000 range for a channel, is my understanding. So those are some things in between that you're looking for. Rakesh, thanks for the super chat. New place and have a tight budget, but would want to do minimum sound treatment. What would you do? Educational videos, recording home, work desk. Tips, I would use a dynamic microphone would be my first choice if you can't do any sort of sound treatment. And you can do temporary sound treatment, hopefully. That would be kind of the best thing. I don't know how reverberant the space is that you're working in, but that's the typical problem I find in kind of a home work desk type of situation. But if you can, I would probably look at a dynamic microphone. The downside is it does have to be probably in the frame. It has to be pretty close to your mouth. The positive is that it will manage the room and it will sound a lot better. So it won't pick up as much of the room ambiance. Those are my first thoughts on that. Or even with a condenser microphone, if you keep it close, it can still be better. All right, Mr. Ferriani. Curtis, 2 questions. What is a cheaper way to power a Mixpre 10 than smart batteries? Don't like the L mount with Sony type batteries. Okay, so what I use is V mount batteries with D-tap outputs. So I just use a cable. That looks like this. So I have it in a sound bag, so I don't know what your situation is exactly, but this is the Hiroshi input that goes into the Mixpre 10, D-tap that goes into the cinema battery, and 99% of cinema batteries these days have D-tap outputs, so I can plug this into there, other end into the Mixpre 10, And this sits in the sound bag and powers it for a lot longer than those Sony L series batteries typically do anyway. This is a really tiny cinema battery, but the bigger one's even better. So you can get into a cinema battery with a D-tap output for about $150 probably for a decent one, and then the cable's another $30 or $40. So that's what I would do, and that's typically what I do actually. All right, and then the second question, what is the budget option to have 2 mics to record ambiance in stereo? The budget option is to use a Zoom F1 or a Zoom H1. That's the budget option. Did I get that right? H1, yeah. H1N is probably the cheapest way to do it. It's $80 or $90. Now, if you're talking about microphones to feed into your mix pre, I mean, there's a Samson CO2, but those don't sound awesome. They're okay, but they're not awesome. I'd probably go with a Zoom H1 before I went with the Samson CO2s. I don't know if anyone has other ideas in the chat. Definitely let us know. But what was the other budget microphone? There's the... Yeah, that's the thing that I do too. Typically, is it like if I need to record ambiance while I'm also recording dialogue, I'll just put up a handy recorder for the ambiance and then get the dialogue with the boom mic and the lav mic. Is typically how I approach it. If you need, and I don't know what low budget option for 2 XLR based microphones, how you define budget exactly, but Sennheiser has some pencil condenser microphones that you might consider that are probably in the $200 range. I'm trying to remember what they're called. Sennheiser wired microphones. It's probably going to be under instrument microphones. Yeah, here's the E614 supercardioid. So you might use 2 of those in either, however you're doing it, whether you're doing ORTF or XY or whatever. But you could use a couple of those. There's the E914, which is a little bit more expensive. Or you could go with an Ambio, but that's a different game altogether. I'm not really recommending that. That's a different game for not only price reasons, but also you're taking up 4 inputs there. And then if you go on the higher end, of course, there's going to be something like the 8040 or the 8020. So anyway, I would probably, again, on the budget end, I'd probably say the E614 is worth taking a look at. Just kind of a straight ahead. It's really made as an instrument mic, but you could capture some nice ambiance with that as well. Okay. Mr. Shoji, not an audio question. In your experience, how far can you run an HDMI cable into an A10 Mini Pro? I would not go more than 15 feet. So what is that? 5 meters, roughly? 5 yards-ish? That would be my sense. If you're going to go longer than that, you probably need a repeater or an amplifier for the HDMI cable, or you need to convert to SDI, run it, and then convert it back to HDMI, or whatever you're doing. So those are my thoughts on that. You can get longer HDMI cables. I think some people will say, you could probably run them maybe 25 feet, but I think you're starting to get into risky territory there. And I also find that those cables, they tend to be really thick, and so they're a little harder to run long distances as well. At that point, you're better off with an SDI cable if you can. So that's my experience on that. Don't know more context than that, but hopefully that's helpful. Ken, does your Sound Devices 888 use the same key shortcuts for playback as your old Sound Devices 633? I rented a 633 and was surprised how hard it was to listen to several tracks recorded previously. I don't remember. I don't have the 633 anymore to compare them side by side, but I'm not sure. Are you talking about, so there's the little joystick that you use for the transport control. That's pretty straightforward. I think it's the same on both. Switching between headphone presets is basically the same on both. Maybe, I'm not sure what you're talking about, Ken. So are you finding that like pushing the transport joystick to the left works differently on the 888 versus the 633? The thing is, I've had this 888 for long enough now that it's second nature, so I'm not sure. exactly how it's different. And it's been long enough since I've touched the 633, and I sold that to a friend. So yeah, I'm not sure. Hadn't noticed that. I'd be interested to know more details, though, if you've got them. Okay, Mark. I use a Sennheiser AVX, and looking at the Shure TL48, I noticed they don't have TRS. What would you use a microdot to TRS, or would you suggest a different transceiver for that mic? Well, the Shure Twinplex is a unabashedly professional level lavalier microphone, so they've really kind of made it for the professional level systems. And by professional level, I don't mean to diss the Sennheiser AVX. The AVX is really made for videographers, to be 100% honest. It's a good system. I don't have any issues with it. But it's not something that a production sound mixer typically would use. Just to make that distinction. So I'm not saying anything bad about the AVX, just that it fits a certain niche. Yeah, I would probably use microdot. In fact, that's what I did when I did my review of the Shure Twinplex, is we used a microdot adapter. So we used we had the microphone terminated with microdot, and we had a microdot to 3.5 millimeter adapter, and that worked fine. So that's what I would do. Brian, I want to record in a church for a classical concert events, but not sure what to go with, Omni or Cardioid Sennheiser MKH compact condenser microphone, stereo set. Well, for a classical concert, typically, my understanding is engineers will almost always, they will typically use cardioid microphones, a stereo pair. So this is not my expertise area, but just in what I've observed is it's usually a condenser, cardioid, pencil condenser set of microphones that they use, and they do various techniques from there. But in some cases, I imagine you could use omnidirectional, although I think that it needs to be a case where the church sounds really great, and I would think that would be an additional set of microphones as opposed to the primary set of microphones. You're trying to capture the reverb there at that point. Those are some of my thoughts there, but if anyone has more experience recording in churches and specifically concerts like that, definitely let us know in the chat there. So good. Hope that goes, that sounds fun, Brian. I'd love to try it, actually. Okay, next up from TicTac2930. Do you have any cheap options for a ATEM mini device? I'd like to play around with video switching. Well, the ATEM mini is $295, so I'm assuming you're looking for something less expensive than that. Who was it? Feel World, I think, makes... they recently, Feel World, who mostly makes monitors, like budget monitors for on-camera use. I think they have a switcher. Yes, they do. They have the Feel World Live Pro L1. However, it's the exact same price as the ATEM Mini, so it's not any less expensive. It does have a confidence monitor on here, a little screen here. Do they show it on in any of these pictures? They don't. But they also have a little T-bar, which is kind of a nice addition that you don't have on the ATEM Mini, although I don't know how Do we use the T-bar?
No.
Emma doesn't use it. We have a big T-bar over here, and she never touches it. You just use auto, right?
Yeah.
To do the transitions.
Yep.
This one's pretty similar in a lot of ways to the ATEM Mini, it looks like, although I haven't heard of as many of these out there as the ATEM Minis. So I don't really know of any less expensive than that. Let's take a quick switcher look here. The problem is this is going to pull up a bunch of other crazy stuff. This is an amazing deal now. This dropped by $100, the ATEM Mini Pro. Pretty good deal there. These are all much more expensive. I think about $300 is the least expensive you're going to get to, unless someone else knows of one. But the least expensive one I've seen is about that. So here's the Feel World again, $300. If you have if you already have an Atomos recorder, I think a lot of those now support switching. But yeah, this, as far as I'm aware, actually, let's do one more thing. With B&H, you can have it list it, filter by, or sort by. How do you sort it by lowest to highest? I thought there was a way to do that.
There is. It's under sort by.
Where's sort by? Here. Okay, here it is. Low to high. Here we go. What you do need to avoid is the kind of HDMI switchers which are meant for sitting behind your TV and switching different inputs. So your game console versus maybe a Blu-ray player versus whatever else you may have hooked up to the TV. Those are not going to work because in at least 99% of cases, because what those do is those don't keep the HDMI inputs active. So when you switch from one to the other, everything kind of goes offline for a few seconds while it's renegotiating with the other HDMI that you switched to. And then it brings it on. So it's not for live production like this. So you have to watch out for those. And I think that's what all these are here, really. We're going to have to jump forward a few pages to get into something. Yeah, I'm not going to waste any more time on the, on the live stream here. But if anyone else knows in the chat of something less than $300 for switching other than the Feel World or the A10 Mini, then let us know in the chat. Ken, maybe the joystick was sticky, but every time I tried loading previous takes, it would actually start recording. I was trying to find the track list similar to the MixPre track page. Yeah, so if I have to go back and find a specific one, I'll go into the files menu. But yeah, it does sound like something funky was going on with that joystick. I don't entirely love the joystick, I'll be honest about that. Do you love the joystick?
I don't know how to use the E well enough to...
Yeah, but push up to start recording and push in to stop.
Ian is kind of scary because I feel like I'm going to just push it up again.
Yeah.
I don't know, it's all right.
It's all right, but it's not our favorite either. It works, unless it gets sticky. If it gets sticky, then I imagine it would be a mess. But yeah, I usually go into the file menu if I had to queue to a specific take. Mr. Danielson again, what's the most common problem when you get rustle from a lav and how to avoid it? I use a DPA 4060 or MKE2 with original clip on the shirt or suit, and when we hit record, it starts. I don't know why it would start when you hit record. That's a little strange, but if it's not happening, I mean, if you're hearing the inputs from your mics and you're not hearing any of that, either the person's not moving or something funny is going on somewhere else in the signal chain. But typically it's clothing rustle. It's the clothing rubbing against the microphone, or it's the sound of the clothing. Even if you have it, I don't know if you're hiding the DPA 4060, you say it's on the shirt or suit. If it's on the outside, then what you're hearing the clothing rubbing against itself, and it's just sound that's close to the microphone, and so it picks it up. What I find a lot of times is moving out to the lapel on a jacket is generally quieter. You're not going to pick up as much as the shirt, but even if they move their arms, you're going to start picking it up again. So it has a lot to do with clothing that the person's wearing. So that's what I've generally found there. If you're hiding it, now that's a completely different thing. Hiding it, you have to somehow find a way to keep the clothing from moving against the capsule of the microphone. And I actually, interestingly, find it a lot easier to mic women that way because most women are wearing fairly fitted tops, and you can just have them put the microphone on the strap of their bra between the cups behind it, and then you almost never get that rubbing sound, that clothing rubbing against the microphone sound. So that's pretty good there. For men, I typically try to go between the pecs a little bit and hoping that the pecs will hold the clothing away from the microphone a little bit. I also use typically moleskin. I use a moleskin sandwich kind of setup where I kind of pinch the microphone between two layers of moleskin and then attach the moleskin to the chest here just below the pecs, or between the pecs and below a tiny bit. So hopefully there's a little space there between the shirt and the microphone. So that's typically how I approach that. It's not always going to work. Sometimes if people are wearing the wrong clothes that just make a lot of noise, they just make a lot of noise. And so I put them on the outside at that point if you can, and again, move them off to the side on the lapel of a jacket as opposed to on the shirt. A lot of shirts tend to make a lot of noise. And then you also get the shirt rubbing and the jacket rubbing against the shirt. That can make a bit of noise as well. So depending on the piece you're doing, if it's an interview, I hate to do this, but if it's really bad, you might have to ask them to be a little bit more conservative in how they're moving, which is, you never want to have to do that because you don't want sound to be defining what they can and can't do in an interview. But sometimes you got to do what you got to do. If you have a boom mic, then you can probably get around some of that. So those are some thoughts there. All right, Mark.
This isn't me. This is a joke.
This is a joke, I figured, because it came from Mark. So I want to increase my viewers' attention by starting to do all my Zoom work meetings from a hot tub, as I have seen this to be highly effective on Twitch. What kind of microphone do I need? I'd get a Deity S Mic 2, and if it drops in the hot tub, it's just a matter of drying it out again. It'll probably work right away, but that's what I would do. So good luck, Mark. Sounds like you're going to have some nice, comfortable meetings coming up here soon. So good luck with that. All right, my friends, that brings us to the end of another Sound for Video session. Happy Mother's Day again for those that are celebrating Mother's Day. Is that just a U.S. thing or is that around the world? I don't even know.
That's a Western civilization thing. Most countries have something similar.
Western civilization thing, in any case. Get out there, make some great sound. Take care of your moms today, and we'll talk to you again next week. Take care, everybody.